start that now. And I'd like to welcome everybody to this submission writing party tonight. I just open with a short karakia. Whiti ora ki te whaiao ki te ao marama. Whiti ki runga, whiti ki raro, e nunu ki te pohatu, e nunu ki te rākau. Ti taha ki tēnei taha, ti taha ki te rataha, ti hei, Māori ora. Kia ora and welcome everybody. Super nice to have you here tonight. And it's great that we've got a kind of manageable group for doing this submission writing party. This is going to be reasonably informal, but we're going to take you through our submission template, and then Liam and Angela and I are here to answer questions, though other people here might have expertise as well. So yeah, we just want to make this a kind of conversational space. So in the first instance, I'll just turn over to Angela to do an overview and outline of the session this evening.
Kia ora. Yeah, so basically I'm going to give you just a brief overview of some of the websites and documents that you might find useful. And then we're opening out for Liam and Val to outline the key points in the template that that Val and has been doing a lot of work on, and we hope that you'll find really useful. And then after that or during that, we'll have questions, and we'll see how we go for time there. In terms of whether we've got time to kind of do a little bit of writing and chatting as we go, start writing our own documents. So yeah, now I'm aware that there'll be a real breadth of experience in terms of people's submission writing, from never done this before to have done lots and lots of this. So those of you who are really experienced, please bear with us. We're going to start take it from the real basics. So I'm going to share screen now and go to the first screen. And that is just to, and probably many of you will have already looked at this, but in case you haven't, if you want to follow along with me on your computer at home, just put in the horizons.govt.nz URL, and then on that page, where we're going is down natural resources. So on that white line there, down, just slide your cursor down to publicly notified. So if I click on that, and feel free to shout out if I'm going too quickly here. So on this page, I'm going to just scroll down until I find this Bioplant Manawatu New Zealand Limited, and click on that page there. So this is the key page in terms of all the documents that are available for you to download and look at. So these are all the documents that Bioplant has attached to as part of their application. Plus also the last document in the list, number 23, is the technical review of the application. So Horizons contracted this organisation to do a technical review of the proposal, and that was.
Angela, I'll just stop you there. That document number 23 is actually the Bioplant technical review,
right?
Not the Horizons
one, right?
Horizons one, yeah, that's the one that was submitted with their resource consent application. Apologies, you carry on.
No. So can we put a link to the assessors report maybe in chat so people can access that? You won't need it for tonight, you won't need it for this workshop, but it's a useful thing to have had a look at. Thank you. So what I'm going to and then below that it outlines all the things that you need to have in a submission, but I'm not going to go into that because Val has included all that in our template, so we'll leave it till later to go into that. Now, there's a couple of like quick and easy ways that you can do submissions, and one of them is to go back to the previous page on that Horizons website. There is a submission form that you can download if you prefer to just fill in boxes and just type in a little bit of information. Now, one of our group has very kindly created a partially filled out one just to show you how that might work. So all the usual fields around name and contact details and so on. And then you tick the boxes to say whether you oppose or support the application, whether you wish to be heard in respect of your submission, and whether you're willing to attend a pre-hearing meeting, should there be one. Now, Val, do you want to say anything about the idea of like what we're kind of suggesting is that you, if you feel able to speak to your submission, that you tick that box? Yeah,
I can just simply say that obviously it's great to preserve your options in terms of speaking to your submission. So if you tick yes that you would like to speak to your submission, and you subsequently decide at a later point that actually you're not able to speak to it, or you don't have anything further that you want to add, or you don't feel confident to do that, or whatever else, that's absolutely fine. But if you tick no that you don't want to speak to it, then they're not going to contact you. They're not going to ask you about speaking to it. So if you tick yes, you preserve your options. Yes, Bruce is asking, is that a virtual appearance? It would be very likely to be a virtual appearance. And so I guess we also kind of want to send a message that people are concerned, that they do want to have their concerns aired in a public forum. And so that's the great opportunity about oral hearings, and certainly some of the feedback that we've gotten from people who've been through a few of these processes is that the commissioners, the people that are tasked with evaluating this proposal, are really interested in that oral evidence. So yeah, at this stage, we are encouraging people. In terms of the pre-hearing meetings, my understanding is that is something that people may wish to participate in if there are going to be negotiations about particular consent conditions. And so if the council's saying, well, Bioplant has offered this, are you open to this kind of an idea? You can simply say no, or you can say yes. And I guess tactically it might be, I don't really have a view either way, whether or not, because we don't necessarily want to go into some sort of mediation with Bioplant about what's going to be an acceptable level of contamination for our communities. Yeah. Back to you, Angela.
Yeah. So then on the second page, there's just 3 boxes. So the first one is what specific parts of the application do you support or oppose? And so Alida in this example has said just we oppose all parts of this application, which is our stance. The second box is stating your reasons for opposing the application, and you can put in there, and if you want to just make it very brief, bullet points like this, or you might want to use a different format if you want to do a longer proposal or submission. And then finally, state what you wish Horizons to state the decision you want them to make, and we want them to decline the application. So that's one very simple way of, if you don't want to write a lot, that's one way that you could do your submission. Now, the other way of doing it is just as a letter. So as an example, this is what Manawatu District Council is sending in they're supporting the plant, so don't use that idea. But it's just a straight letter addressed to, in this case, they've addressed it specifically to the consents person at Horizons, listed the application number, and that it's about the Bioplant Manawatu application. So that it doesn't have to be fancy. You know, as soon as we say the words, you know, put in a submission, it sounds kind of scary, but it can just be a straight letter or email. So the last one that we want to talk about and that we'll use as a focus for the rest of the evening is the template that Val's been working on, and so in this part one is just explaining about the submission process. We have to send the application both to Horizons and to Bioplant. So there's the two email addresses are there, and we need to get it in by the 31st of March at 4:45.
Angela, we're not seeing anything on your screen at the moment.
Oh, okay.
But you probably can stop. You can probably.
Yeah, because you can pick it up from there. Yep, cool.
All right. Let's see how this goes. All right, so is everybody able to see the Feilding Against Incineration Community Submission template? Great. So Liam, I might just get you to share that link in the chat with people. So if people want to jump to that. Most of this stuff is the stuff that Angela just went through. And I think it's really important to be clear that you can simply do this stuff in an email. So you can just start an email, you can start a Word document, whatever you like, and you can just simply send your submission to the two email addresses at the top here, the consent.submissions@Horizons and the ttopol@bioplant.co.nz. So we're required to send it also to Bioplant when we're making a submission. You don't need to use any specific form, but there is some specific information that you need to have on your application, and that includes the application number, your name, your contact information, what part of the application your submission relates to, and we're suggesting it relates to the whole thing, whether you support or oppose the application, and what decision you want the council to make, and whether you want to be heard in support of the submission. So again, you can just simply do this as a regular old email to those two email addresses. So we have a whole bunch of points on this document that we want to go through. So I might turn over to Liam to kick us off with a couple of the first important things on this submission template. And we're not going to run through this, word for word, but just really to run through some of the highlights.
Yeah.
One of the things that we did think about was whether you might want to open a Word doc on your own screens, if there's anything that you wanted to jot down or copy and paste from the template as we go. So yeah, that's a possibility too.
Yeah, it's a good idea if you just have thoughts as we're going through this. And so all of these points that we'll run through and summarize, none of it's really new. It's sort of points that we've discussed across the various presentations and meetings we've had in the past. So and you can, I guess, pick and choose which points you feel resonate most with you and which you feel are most important. You don't have to include everything. And if you have any questions about if you want anything clarified, please feel free to raise your hand or write a question in the chat. and we'll attempt to respond to that. So the first point that we have is around the fact that this facility really is based on untested technology, kind of despite what the company says that they have been running for a while. It's actually very difficult to find any examples of similar facilities that they claim are up and running. A lot of the facilities that they refer to in their documents are either concepts, so not actually haven't actually been built yet, and so there's just sort of modeling being done, but no real world data. Or some of them they refer to a couple of facilities in Korea, but there really is very little information, public information on those facilities, and also, you know, what the sort of environmental regulations that they have to meet are in Korea. So really there is not a lot of information about what this technology actually looks like in the real world. So we've got a few points about that there. And I think that's quite an important one in terms of, you know, do we really want this untested technology, which we have a lot of concerns about the environmental and human health impacts around? Do we want Feilding to be the testing ground for something like this? And what are the implications if, you know, if a lot of the negative impacts are indeed do indeed happen? So anything you wanted to add to that, Val or Angela? Great. So Val, do you want to take the next one?
I will say only just very briefly that many of you will have been on our public meeting. You will have heard from Miditi about how Aorangi Marae feels about the issue, and just simply that they don't actually agree with this. So we've just simply said that we do not think that the consultation that's been done with Mana Whenua is appropriate. So Liam, I don't know if you want to talk on to, and I just say, I guess, in terms of resource management, you know, local Māori have kaitiaki responsibilities, and those need to be given proper weight and consideration in any project, let alone when it's 500 meters from their marae, and they're saying it's going to contaminate their water, their land and their air. So yeah, we really strongly encourage everyone to include a line about that and to support the local people. And they've already made their submission. Aorangi Marae has already made their submission to the council, and they, I'm sure, would appreciate any solidarity and support that people want to express along with them about their objection. Yeah.
And I guess another just quick point that isn't on the list there in relation to Aorangi Marae is it is almost directly in the path of the prevailing westerly winds. And so if we're concerned about air pollution and emissions, which is the next main topic, then, you know, Aorangi Marae and any other, you know, homes are kind of directly in the firing line, so to speak. So yeah, air pollution and emissions is another is key topic that we've got here in the template. It's also the issue that Bioplant themselves have probably focused the most on. It is, you know, when we look at waste to energy technologies around the world and all different types of waste to energy technologies, air pollution is one of the key issues that they often get caught on, or they are required to provide a lot of information about the pollution controls and how they're going to prevent air emissions, because basically they are incinerating either waste directly, but in this case they're incinerating the gases that come from the pyrolysis process, and that can release all sorts of harmful toxins and emissions. So we heard from Tricia Farrelly, I think, who's here on the call as well, so feel free to chip in, Tricia. But we heard from Tricia at the community meeting 2 weeks ago about a whole range of toxic chemicals that can be released in this process, that things like dioxins, which are very harmful even at extremely low levels, and we know for sure, the company has admitted that this facility will produce dioxins even if they are at very low levels. And there are a few points there also around the independent technical report that the Regional Council commissioned, that some of the what do you call them, standards and the tests that they used to determine the impacts of air emissions are not necessarily applicable, and the other issue they highlighted is they don't necessarily identify the worst case scenarios. So they might be looking at optimum scenarios, but there might be instances where more emissions are emitted than when it's just running as normal as it's meant to be. Anything you wanted to add, Val?
No, I think the main thing that I would add about the air pollution and emissions, forgive me if you said this, Liam, is just that in the company's applications and in the number of schematic drawings and things that are in there, there are a lot of things that are really contradictory. And we believe that there are emissions that are totally unaccounted for in any of their projections. Like, there are things that in their application in terms of the processes that just simply don't make sense. So we've got some real concerns that not the totality of the impacts are really not being made evident.
And again, I think a lot of these issues, they do connect in with one another. So the fact that this is quite untested technology may mean that the sum total of the potential emissions that come from this facility are not actually accounted for, because the technology is actually just not that well understood. There aren't, at least in New Zealand, there aren't really any technical experts on pyrolysis, particularly for waste and plastics. But even globally, it is sort of not super well understood. Now,
Liam, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Hi guys, sorry I'm late. I was cooking dinner tonight. Gasification and pyrolysis are very similar, is that correct?
They are reasonably similar, yes.
So historically, New Zealand, you had, like in my hometown in Masterton, our worst contaminated site is the old gasworks site, where coal was gasified to produce gas, which was pumped around the city, and produced creosote, which people used to, and tar seal products, which people used to like paint their fences and stuff like that, and then coke, which used to use sort of like as a gravel aggregate on your drive. Back in the day, you could sort of get it for free. And like historically, gasification has resulted in like hundreds of contaminated sites around New Zealand, and that is gasifying a relatively unified substrate, coal, relative to a whole lot of diverse plastics and hazards and whatever. Is that a reasonable comparison to make in terms of, hey guys, we don't have a precedent for pyrolysis, but we have a precedent for widespread use of gasification. Back in the day, it was a normative technology, and now we're left with all this residue of contaminated sites right across New Zealand. I know in my hometown, Masterton, that you can't build on the old gasworks site. The best use is to tar seal or concrete over it so that no dust or excavation can occur. So I don't know how widespread that is, and I'm not into the whole contaminated sites field, but I sort of wanted to just register with others what they thought about that as a sort of like a comparison, because we don't necessarily do a lot of pyrolysis in terms of impacts that people may not have kind of realized because it's sort of a generation ago.
Yeah, that's awesome. I see Tricia's got her hand up. Tricia, did you want to speak to that question that point specifically?
Yeah, I would. Thanks for that question, Jonathan. I think it's a really important question for us to contend with here, because I think that I do think in some sense we have to stay with a specific technology we've been confronted with within the limitations that we obviously have, purely because there's, as Val has said, there's a number of contradictions in the application and lack of information and even fuzziness. Speaking of fuzziness, my camera just goes fuzzy. That was perfect timing. But fuzziness of graphics and that sort of thing as well in their application. You can't even see some of the terms that they use and understand sort of what flows are going from one point to another. But the point that I want to make is that we as much as we possibly can speak to the kinds of technologies we're confronted with in this particular case, but then also perhaps provide broader context around the sorts of industrial technologies we've been confronted with in the past. And an example is the one that Jonathan's just raised here, to state some of the as kind of a warning for us all when the application process has not been critically enough addressed. And certainly this is a perfect example of that, where we have PDP, for example, who haven't really critically enough reviewed the process. They've just taken a lot of the information that Bioplant has provided at face value. They've taken a singular route to look at emissions to air, for example, and not even a complete and holistic and systemic approach to even that in their risk assessment. But I would say that using those examples of other cases where we've been left with long-term toxics as a result of poor submission, a poor process of going through a consenting process, it would be really, really good to raise. I think certainly bringing up the precautionary approach, I think this is a really excellent example of poor application of precautionary principles, and this is absolutely essential in industrial activity of this kind. So the long and short of it, Jonathan, is yes, but also with a focus on the kinds of technology, the kinds of waste to energy technology that Bioplant are proposing within the realms of, or the limitations of the information they've provided.
Yeah, I would say thanks very much for the heads up. I will follow up with Wasteman's because they've got a contaminated lands group within Wasteman's, which is essentially the sort of big waste management kind of mother organization for New Zealand. And I'm very interested to follow up on that because there is a great deal of literature about the mixed waste pyrolysis that basically says one of the major problems is the heterogeneous feedstock that's being fed through, as opposed to homogeneous feedstocks for other processes. So for gasification and things like that, where the technology is a bit more in a bit more widespread use. For mixed municipal waste, there's just almost none of it going on because it's just so much unknown, and the stuff that's coming out of it is so heavily contaminated. So the land stuff is really interesting. So it'd be good to follow up on that.
Yeah, I just want to add to that too. I fully support that, Val, as well. And I think an important thing we need to address also is the kind of nomenclature, the kind of terms or words that are used in here, or actually more accurately misused and abused. So terms like biochar, terms like biodiesel, these are incorrect terms. They've even used the incorrect terms here to in some ways greenwash the process and present it as something quite different from what it actually is. Because of the mixed municipal waste largely that's used as feedstocks here, that's hardly ever used anywhere else. And in fact, where it has been used, it's been a huge failure in terms of environmental impact and otherwise.
So can I just query, are the points that people are raising being captured and turned into kind of thumbnails for submissions? Because I didn't capture all the what Tricity has said, but it sounded really good.
I think actually Val and Liam have done a really good job with what you're looking at here. I think that they've actually thumbnailed it here, and I should probably stop speaking because Liam's probably going to get to all of the points I've raised at least anyway, and what he's done. So I'll let him go for it. Thank you.
No, that's great. Thanks for sharing that, Jonathan, and Tricia for giving that extra information too. I think it's, yeah, I think, yeah, I won't add anything more to that, but I think it's really, really important to look at the context and what's happened previously as well. Val, I don't know if you wanted to talk about odor.
I won't talk very much except to say that odor is a big issue out of this. And yeah, there are a number of points there. People can read them. And certainly if you are going to be anywhere in the surrounding community, this could be an issue that you particularly may want to include in your submission. So happy to answer any more questions about the stuff that's written in there. Yeah, but otherwise I'll just leave it to you, Liam, to talk to climate change.
Can I just start? I wanted to reference this query against anybody that actually lives in Feilding. I take my boys out really regularly over the summer, and they do their track cycling racing around the track at Feilding, and depending on which way the wind is blowing, the wastewater treatment plant is really stinky and offensive, and kind of, I guess it's, you know, it's maybe it's a little bit of a generalized point, but it's sort of like my instinct when I hear about odor and something like this is NDC can't even run a wastewater treatment plant properly to reduce odor, and that's a known technology. That's something that's done all around New Zealand, and when the wind blows the wrong way, it gets really, really smelly. And I kind of, one of the things that, like, I've been writing points in addition to Liam's amazing work, is that it seems to me like MDC is, and possibly Horizons as well, although they might not like hearing this, are really probably underfunded and ill-equipped and don't have the capacity to monitor how well this company runs their business. And you could easily end up with sort of another issue around odor. And as I said, my observation is they already have a really bad issue in terms of wastewater treatment. And you know, what are they going to do with the company, and how can they shut it down, and all of that kind of stuff.
Thanks, Jonathan. And yeah, I think that one of the main issues with the odor in this that we've tried to pick up on is that, like many of the other issues, there is a lot of inconsistency in the way they're proposing to manage that issue, and we just don't really feel like we have the certainty that, you know, it is going to be the way they say it's going to be. So yeah, if that's an issue that is of concern, it's definitely worth raising that. I'll just try to quickly speak to the climate change issues. Then I won't go into too much detail because unfortunately, with the Resource Management Act we have at the moment, climate change is not something that councils really have to consider in a resource consent application like this. That is set to change because the government is planning to revamp the Resource Management Act and put in new legislation which will empower councils to look at climate change. But at the moment, it's probably not going to be a sort of a deciding factor in this particular case. But it is important to point out that because, again, as others have said, Tricia and others have said, that there are a lot of claims made by this company, and one of the claims is that this pyrolysis facility will save CO2 emissions. I think they claim something like 35 or 37,000 tons of CO2 emissions will be saved by this facility. I mean, I talked about this in my presentation 2 weeks ago, but there are just all sorts of holes and miscalculations in how they've arrived at that figure. In particular, that they don't even factor in, or probably the most significant thing is they don't factor in the emissions that will come from the 14,000 litres of diesel that they plan to produce, which is the main byproduct really of this facility. You know, diesel, as we know, is a very highly emitting fuel, and this is, will be in large part made from plastics that they will put through the facility. So this is fossil fuels, and there's not really any denying that this is going to be fossil emissions. 14,000 litres of it's going to be burnt, but they don't factor that into any of their calculations. They also make some points around their one of Bioplant's big selling points is, they're avoiding landfilling a lot of this stuff, but of course it's only the organic waste that produces emissions from landfill. So maybe they're reducing a little bit of that, but what about all the plastics and stuff? Well, that stuff doesn't produce emissions in landfill. They're instead turning it into something that will produce emissions like fuel and gas, etc. So that doesn't really stack up. And I think also they just don't factor in a whole lot of emissions that come from, the facility itself is incredibly complex, and it involves many different steps and processes that a lot of them are very energy intensive. For example, just to turn the pyrolysis gases and liquids into a usable diesel is a very energy intensive process. And how do they factor in that use of energy? There have been a number of studies that show this kind of pyrolysis to produce this kind of diesel and stuff like that is just doesn't stack up in terms of the amount of energy you need to do all this stuff versus the amount of energy you get out of it. It actually uses more energy than you get from it. So I'll leave that there in terms of the climate change effects, but I'm thoroughly convinced that this, despite what they say, it's actually going to be a net contributor to climate change, and that's not even taking into account that the fact that they are it's the kind of technology that just encourages more waste to be produced, which itself, producing waste, has huge climate change implications when you look right up the supply chain from production and extraction of raw materials. So if we should actually be trying to avoid that waste being produced in the first place, rather than just turning it into stuff to burn.
Liam, can I just add a quick note there?
Yeah.
It was really interesting in Bioplant's presentation that they were going to need to not only make sure everything was very, very, very carefully sorted, but also dried, and that extra energy was going to be needing to be used to clean and dry the feedstock before it could possibly be fed into the pyrolysis plant.
Yeah, that's right. So there's just so many stages like that and along their whole process that require energy to go into it, that it just, again, the energy input seems to be far more than what they actually get out of it. The next point.
Can I just add in just around your comment about, they're not required to take climate change into account, just to say that example that I used of a submission, the Manawatu District Council submission, it has absolutely nothing to do with pretty much anything that's in the application. It's purely context. It's purely talking about why they think pyrolysis would be good for a pyrolysis plant, would be good for the district. So I think we need to make sure we talk to the important points, but I don't think we need to limit ourselves or be concerned to paint the broader picture. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's right, Angela. Yeah, thanks for making that point.
Shall I talk to toxic char? Yeah. So I think there has been some mention of this, but part of the pyrolysis process, then essentially the material that's left over, the residue, is called char. It might in a traditional incinerator be called ash, but it's not actually ash, it's char. The Bioplant application likes to call it biochar, and I think it's been already noted this evening. Biochar is from organic materials. You cannot get biochar from plastic. What's really concerning is that the Bioplant application suggests that this might actually be a really useful soil conditioner. And so they're actually suggesting that people spread it on paddocks and fields to enhance the nutrient value of the ground.
Oh,
this is really, really dangerous stuff, really scary. And the fact that it's in an application like this is either just astonishing ignorance or willful intention to pollute on an epic scale. Like I feel almost sick talking about it because it's just such a repugnant idea. So there's the issue with the biochar, and that's 2.5 tons a day of biochar. Now in Germany, this stuff has been ruled to be hazardous waste and must be dealt with particular specific protocols around hazardous waste. So I don't think there's any consideration been given in this application whatsoever to the issue of this being hazardous waste, and whether or not the landfill at Bonnie Glen is happy to take this hazardous waste, or if this material would have to be dealt with in some special, very particular kind of way. We really don't know because we don't have any experience with it. So that's the part of the issue with the biochar. They also suggested other places in the application that they might burn some of the biochar for energy. And again, there's no kind of quantification of what emissions from this stuff might be if in fact they were burning the biochar. So those emissions don't seem to have featured in the combustion emissions accounting that has gone on in the earlier part of the application. So the other thing that we just want to mention is about the kind of filters and scrubbers. And again, I kind of go back to the point I started with. There's a lot of contradictory information in the application that says some of the gases that are released, some of them they say, oh, well, they'll be scrubbed once or they'll be scrubbed twice, but that actually the diagrams and the drawings don't actually really show that. But they also don't have any plan for what they're going to do with the contaminated materials from these filters and scrubbers, or what they're going to do, in fact, with the filters and scrubbers themselves, which they call a bag house. And they're usually a sort of a fabric filter of some description, and they've got some carbon filters as well. And all of this stuff also has to be disposed of. So I think one of the points is really that, people think that these kinds of facilities kind of magic away the waste, but actually, of course, you cannot magic away waste. You just transform it into something else. And in this case, transform it into something vastly more toxic than what it was to begin with, which was just ordinary household waste. So I'll leave it at that. Again, happy to answer questions, but I'll turn over to Liam to talk to the kind of zero waste stuff and what's actually going on with Manawatu's rubbish at the moment.
Can I ask a question? Is it relevant to submit that given this operation is premised on land disposal of this hazardous material that they're calling biochar, that to actually submit that they need to have a apply for emission to ground and then to groundwater because of the potential for leachate? Is that something that we can submit on, or is that an added something that will be dismissed?
Yep.
I would strongly advise people to submit that actually additional consents really should be required out of this. I think Liam can talk more knowledgeably about the wastewater issue than I can, but certainly the fact that there haven't been any applications for discharge to land or water has been a consistent concern of ours. So I think one of the last points we have here is about other applications to land and water. We're really concerned that the council doesn't seem to have any plan for anything else. Somewhere along the line, this was decided as being sufficient, and it's clearly not. So I think a strong call for additional consents, additional hoops for them to jump through. So Angela?
What they've said about the emission or the waste, to land is that there's nothing needed because in their application they've said that they will dispose to a suitably certified or whatever landfill. But I think that's another example of where they just take Bioplant's word as fact, that like if that's the case, which landfills, you know, have they agreed to take it? There's no backup. It's just a sales pitch. It's just claims they make. So yeah, I think we need to be asking the questions and saying that they need to apply for the consent.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one more point on that, on the char, is really there's, again, like a lot of things in this consent application, is they say one thing in one part and they say another thing in another part. So they might say, oh yes, some of it might be disposed of landfill, then they talk about it as biochar that can be disposed to land, then they talk about it as being burnt, and then they talk about it as being sold to other users for goodness knows what they might use it for. And again, we just don't know. There's no modeling or no sort of pollution control around any of those uses.
Tristia, did you have a comment?
Really quickly, one of those concerning potential uses can be fly ash brick that's been used overseas and has been written off completely because it's been found to be so toxic. So that could potentially be something that they're touting as a fantastic idea for construction.
Yeah, right. So used as a construction material, put into concrete, used as a concrete barrier or a wall or something like that. Yeah, that's all right. Jonathan?
Yeah, so in terms of strategy for this submission, when you submit against it, that leaves the regional council or whoever's hearing this, yes or no is one option. I'm not an expert on RMA stuff. Can you submit that this is beyond the local expertise? And obviously we can demonstrate a whole lot of inconsistencies, and therefore this application should be elevated to a higher authority with a greater level of resources and scrutiny over and above just getting the sort of, the flyby by a consultant that's kind of rubber stamped it, and then, a bunch of busy regional council staff that may not really understand it.
I mean, I guess I think that you're right, certainly, that the evaluation that's been done of it, like, all my cards on the table here, I am not an expert in any way, shape, or form, but I can read the technical report that was done by PDP for the Horizons Regional Council, and I can see gaping holes in the analysis that they have done. I have no background in this, but I can see that there are enormous questions that have not been answered. And I really am quite stunned that, but I guess what I would say is that the RMA process is just simply one where they're dealing with a technology that they don't understand. The council has asked a couple of additional questions about it, but there isn't anybody who's clearly has an engineering background in this particular area that has an understanding of what the questions are they need to be asking. So Brent, I just see you've got your hand up. Maybe you've got a better handle on that RMA process.
I also wouldn't consider myself an expert, but it's a good question, Jonathan. In my view, I would contest it through the current process. If the decision doesn't contain sufficient conditions or any conditions, which would be the worst case scenario, and is approved just as is, that is then subject to appeal, and anybody that's a submitter could appeal that through to the Environment Court. If you ask for it to go direct to the Environment Court at this stage, it gets quite expensive, and I would say less accessible in terms of getting that community voice in. So I think there's a real opportunity through the Horizons convened hearings process for the community voice to really be accessed and amplified. And if the decision from that is not good, it could then be appealed into the Environment Court, which would be a more technical, more expensive, but possibly also more rigorous process.
Okay, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Brent.
Tristia, did you want to? add something?
I did, and I think that's probably and is pertinent to a whole bunch of different environmental issues, and that what we're actually needing is people who can do systems thinking. So there was a question last time we had one of these forums from somebody who said, asked the question, can, for example, dioxins that are emitted into the air, can they then become present, for example, in freshwater ecosystems? So there you already see a connection between emissions to air and emissions to water. You need someone who can actually bridge the gap between emissions to air, land, and water, and can speak to those. If in the best case scenario, but there's so few people who can actually do that sort of work and think in that way. I'm just identifying a gap.
Cool. Thanks, Tricia. Liam, do you want to carry on with this next section?
Yeah. Yep, I will. And this is another one of those points that I guess was what Angela was raising before, that it not necessarily directly related to the resource consent and the RMA, and not necessarily what will make or break the decision, but is in terms of what the Manawatu District Council are submitting in terms of this resource consent. This is actually probably a direct response to that, because it seems to be that the District Council are saying that this pyrolysis facility is the best possible option to us landfilling all the waste that we currently are. And one thing that those of us in the zero waste world have been trying to argue for quite some time now is that it really isn't about whether landfilling or some kind of waste to energy facility is better or worse. And often we get stuck in the weeds around that, and that's what the Manawatu District Council seem to be getting stuck in. But actually, they are both forms of disposal, and they are both symptoms of a problem that we just keep making waste, and we keep producing waste. And in fact, in some ways, waste to energy facilities are actually, they're kind of hungry mouths to feed, and that they encourage waste to continue to be produced so that we can just keep putting it through this facility that we've spent millions and millions of dollars on to get our return on investment. And so we're really trying to make the point that if Manawatu District Council is really interested in reducing waste, then they should be investing in activities that actually stop waste coming into the district in the first place, stop waste being produced in the district in the first place, and follow the waste hierarchy, which is about preventing waste from being made, reusing resources, recycling and composting before we think about disposing of it. So again, there's a Zero Waste Network. There's a lot of information on the Zero Waste Network website about these kinds of things if you wanted to add more detail around that sort of thing. But I think it's really important to challenge this idea that this is a better alternative to landfill.
Cool. And yeah, thanks, Liam. Do you want to add anything else about that?
I'm happy, but yeah, Jonathan.
Do you think it's a relevant point to make that here we are potentially on the cusp of having a container deposit systems? We've banned plastic. There's a bunch of quite assertive things happening around plastic and single-use plastics, and they're setting in place something that's going to be there for decades. Right before we're about to move into a whole new era of quite assertively addressing a problem that you can do literally what Liam is saying. You can reduce it, you can make it go away, you can rethink it. And we're shifting our narrative in terms of the New Zealand waste strategy, shifting into circular economy for better or worse, and the implications of that. And so this is sort of like fixing a problem that exists now, but is going to kind of change the playing field, and yet the fielding is going to be stuck with this this operation, which potentially could go really, really badly wrong for them. Do you think that's a valid point to make?
I think
Yeah.
it's a really valid point. I think it's fascinating that they're talking about reducing rubbish in Feilding and dealing with the waste problem, but actually building this facility would mean, in order to run it, they would actually have to start importing waste. Because if you look at the point at the bottom of the page, the Manawatu region sent about 7,000 tons of rubbish to landfill. That's approximately 19 tons a day. So I've done all this math. They're talking about using 70 tons a day of wet waste, which means 51 tons of wet waste would have to be imported into the community in order to run this plant. And that's without even doing any of the stuff you're talking about, Jonathan, with the banning of hard to recycle plastics, which is underway by the government and due to be implemented within the next year. That's without the container return scheme into place. That's without any of the product stewardship stuff that's coming online that address a whole lot of hard and difficult to deal with products. So we're talking about Feilding actually becoming a net waste importer. And I think that that's something that's really important for the community to get its head around, is this isn't something to deal with your community's waste, which is actually pretty minimal. It's something to deal with waste from outside of the community, which is which is really quite frightening.
So is that 51 tonnes a day import in the, I'm sorry, I haven't read all of the submission. I've sort of just been reading it as we go. Is that number in the submission, Liam's submission?
It's in this community submission template. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
And that's a great point to make, that Feilding's going to become the lame duck community that's going to be getting everybody else's crap.
Yeah.
And they probably don't realise that.
And I think it's fascinating as well, and Angela might want to expand on this, is that Bioplant has said initially that they're not going to take tires. There's an agreement not to take tires, but then they came out and said, actually, we're basically just going to try to soften the community up for a year or two before we start taking tires. Do you want to expand on that, Angela?
Well, all I'm aware of around that was the discussion in last week's Manawatu District Council committee meeting, where they said that, after a period of people getting used to this plant, then they would be likely to reintroduce that proposal. So, it seems that behind the scenes discussions have been had.
Can I just ask a question about the 51 tonnes of wet waste specifically? Can you elucidate a little bit about the wet waste? Thanks.
So what Bioplant is proposing is that their facility needs 40 tonnes a day of dry waste. So their application is actually they're saying we need 70 tonnes of wet waste, and then that would go through this drying process and the shredding process to equal the 40 tonnes a day. So, and obviously municipal waste would be a mix of wet and dry stuff that's coming through, that's all going to have to be separated out, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why I think it's really quite phenomenal. The other thing is that for people who were on our public meeting with Rick Thorpe's organization up in Raglan, their diversion rate is 78%. So Feilding's diversion rate right at the moment is about 32%.
Yeah, Palmy's 38.
Yeah.
Fitching for 48.
Bruce says, does the wet waste include sewage waste? Not that I'm aware of.
I don't think so.
They have not suggested that sewage waste is part of the proposal.
Although they do process sewage in some of their other trial facilities in Korea. So it's potentially, I guess, another issue is that, like with the tires, that they could, if they get set up, they could push to take all sorts of other materials and put it through their system further down the track. So that's really all we'll say about the zero waste thing. But just thanks for that point, Jonathan, as well, around that. really this stuff is out of step with where we're headed as not only in New Zealand, but globally, around climate change and around plastic pollution. All of this stuff, there's all these things happening that are shifting us away from this kind of technology.
Yeah. Can I just add in about the amount of rubbish that might go into it? In the email that Helen Warboys sent us, she said that in the agreement to supply waste, they hadn't had to agree any minimum amount. This all seems fanciful to me because it's not commercial sense, but she says that they don't have an agreement for a minimum amount, and that they're only looking at initial 10-year contract. So the only way that it makes sense to me is they're just desperate to get a plant on the ground, and then they'll import waste from anywhere everywhere else if they but I find it hard to believe that MDC would not supply as much waste as they had. There seems no reason why they wouldn't. Yeah.
Drying waste is going to cause a whole lot of odor in itself, apart from the additional energy calculus which has been ignored on how do you dry stuff. I mean, you just can't just lay it out in the sun because it's going to cause all kinds of flies and rats and odors and bird spreading and everything. So drying commingled municipal waste stinks like hell. I worked at a landfill for 5 years. It's a god-awful smell, and that I think that's something to be kind of considered if they're talking about having to dry all of this stuff. Are they doing odor control over the drying process as well as the pyrolysis process?
Tricia?
Yeah, I think we have to be really, really cognizant too of waste worker sort of rights and health as well, particularly around the odour. My understanding from Andrew's report too is around the problem of needing to absolutely make sure there was plenty of fresh air circulating in the plant so that those waste workers weren't struck down by what he's referred to as garage death, when you're breathing in all these toxic sort of fumes without circulation. And certainly from his perspective, looking at what they're proposing certainly does not look safe for even workers. So it's not only those who are living in communities, it's also waste worker justice as well, the health of those who are working in those facilities to whom they're promising employment. So I think we also need to think beyond that too.
Their application suggests that they will be operating in a negative pressure. The entire building all of the facilities they're saying will be inside and operating at negative pressure, but that means essentially a somewhat enclosed environment. And the point that Tricia was getting at was that there could be buildup of carbon monoxide within the facility, which would be deadly. But also, just speaking to the point that Jonathan was making, that obviously the air that is vented has to be vented somewhere, and it's vented outside. And even if it's vented through filters, even if there are odor filters, those are only as good as they are, set up to be. So is that adequate? How much is that actually going to mitigate that smell? And what are the impacts on the people that are having to deal with that? So, yeah.
Yeah. If they're using a biofilter, which is quite commonly used for composting operations, essentially you then have like acres of bark or whatever media you're using in a biofilter, which then you need to do something with. And they don't work that well. There's been real problems with the composting operation in Christchurch, which has a biofilter system. And so in a sense, that's kind of like it normally, like you can, if it's like a bark media, you can, dispose of it in a sense. But again, that could be one of the things that is not accounted for in terms of exactly how they're going to scrub the air. Yeah, so
they're in the consent application, they're proposing to use some disposable carbon filters. They provide a little bit of information about that, but there is also, again, a bit of lacking information. But yeah, again, they will, however they work, they will need to be eventually disposed of, and they haven't really provided that sort of information.
And there's certainly no information about how many filters there would be, how often those filters would be changed. You know, there's no detail about that kind of stuff. And the little bit of information that Liam's alluding to about the carbon filters is kind of a commercial sales pitch. Literally, it's the photocopied information from the carbon filter company. And it seems like these carbon filters, these are just kind of generic, off the shelf. I want to say maybe slightly something more than you might have in your kitchen. You know, they're really not, they're not kind of industrial level filters as I would have thought would be required for such an operation.
yeah, because if you've got it operating a negative pressure over a whole building, that requires a really strong and well-designed vacuum system, and it's like literally cubic meters of air every second going through. You know, if they are carbon filters or however they're doing it, often, you know, if you're doing it through a bioremediation system, you would, you know, you're talking about like a swimming pool size, you know, bark filter medium that you're then allowing the air to come out of, and you know, that can scrub odors in terms of composting systems. But you know, I guess it's a good point to make that there's not a lot of clarity, or not sufficient clarity, and this stuff perhaps isn't costed into the viability of what they're suggesting. My big issue is, you know, businesses fail and tip over, go bankrupt and walk away all the time. And, you know, New Zealand is continually picking up, I mean, we're doing it with the Maui gas platform and stuff like that, negligent business practices that when they were sold to the community and applying for consents and things like that, it's all magic, it's all going to work. And in the real world, it just doesn't work, because you've got all these problems and complexities, and then who's going to pick up the tab? What kind of bond is this company going to pay? That you know, are they going to park up, you know, $3 or $4 million to clean up this site, or to, you know, pay people who get sick or something like that? This is not like you know, a big company that you can sue. You know, if this tips over, they will be gone and they'll move on. Their learning process might continue or whatever, but there could be a massive legacy issue left behind for the people of Feilding.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think the spin-off effect of that is if a facility, the first facility like this, gets set up, that paves the way for other facilities around the country to be set up, and we could see this process just happen over and over again, and other communities be faced with exactly the same issues and the legacy issues of these failed proposals that leave it to the community to deal with. So that's why I think it's really, this is the first of its kind. I mean, there have been others proposed around New Zealand in the past, but none of them have been successful, and we're really hoping that this one follows suit.
Yeah. One question I've got is how if they're proposing to put leachate or treat material in wastewater, discharge it into the trade waste system, how come they don't need a consent for that? Because, you know, in our region, Wanganui made a mistake with their wastewater treatment system, had a massive blowout, killed off all the bacteria, and had a massive stink for ages. You know, this sounds like it, to me, it sounds like it's a really high risk kind of strategy to be putting this into your trade waste system in a small town with not a particularly sophisticated wastewater treatment plant, which to my nose already has problems in terms of managing how well it works on certain wind conditions. Yeah, I mean, is it reasonable that they should have a that we should submit that they should have a discharge permit or a consent to discharge to groundwater? Or
I think this is a really interesting one, because the land that they are going to proposing to build this facility on is Manawatu District Council resource recovery land. It's it's permitted. It's the same sort of area as the wastewater treatment plant. It has the same sort of consent conditions and stuff like that. And so if they are sending wastewater to the wastewater treatment plant, it comes under the Manawatu District Council's resource consent. And so what they will need, and what they have said in the consent, is that they will get a trade waste permit from the district council, from Manawatu District Council, to discharge their wastewater. And then, if they get that, well, we haven't seen evidence that they actually have that, but they're claiming they will be able to. Then it becomes Manawatu District Council's responsibility that their wastewater that they treat and then discharge doesn't release all sorts of contaminants and whatnot. So it's actually an issue for the district council as well, and it'd be really interesting to, we again haven't seen, there's just been some references to the trade waste permits being sought, but we haven't seen any information around that necessarily.
So it seems like an obvious way that you are transferring a problem into what becomes biosolids, and the biosolids that are discharged eventually from wastewater treatment need to be treated. There was a really good article in The Guardian a couple of days ago about biosolids that had been put onto farmland, and now the farmland's groundwater and was coming up with these forever chemicals. So Tricia, I don't know if you read that same article. So biosolids, when eventually they get extracted from the wastewater treatment, you then have to do something with that. And if there are chemicals being discharged that sort of are beyond, either aren't known about or beyond the kind of consent conditions or stuff like that, there's all of these downstream consequences that could be happening, for a long time.
Yeah, this is all the PFAS contamination stuff that's.
Yeah, it was a had a lovely elderly gentleman who's a farmer who's just sold his farm to some well-meaning people who, it was an organic farm, and they used biosolids as a nutrient source, fertilizer source, and without realizing that the biosolids were contaminated by these forever chemicals, and now they're left with contaminated land, and it was quite a shocking article anyway.
Yeah, there is a bit of that going on in New Zealand. That happens, for example, up north, where people clean out septic systems, and they take the sludge and they essentially spray it onto fields. And it's happening in Tauranga. They've done some sewage sludge onto fields, and they become contaminated sites. So it's definitely not an acceptable way of dealing with the.
And the other issue here from Manawatu, that I don't know exactly where they're at, but a couple of years ago, I know that they were trialing and proposing to actually discharge the wastewater from the wastewater treatment plant onto land. So not just the sludge, but also the wastewater. So instead of discharging it into the river, they would just discharge it onto land. So that's just another way that these contaminants could spread.
Yeah. There's just a couple of other topics that are really on our submission template. This submission template is by no means comprehensive. It is just simply some points of guidance that you may want to pick up on. There may be other things like some of the stuff we've touched on tonight. So don't feel limited in any way by this submission template. Equally well, if you just want to make a quick and easy submission, you can simply pick out a couple of these points, copy and paste them into an email, send them off to the email addresses up at the top of the document, and you can really pretty much be done with your submission. So it can be as in-depth or as short as you want. You can basically say, I oppose this project and I don't want it to go ahead and I want the council to decline this, and you can be done with it. The last couple of things that we have, we've kind of already talked to the issue of applications to discharge to land and water. There has also been the issue of lack of transparency and democratic process. And I guess I just want to ask Angela, do you want to speak to this a little bit? Because this is really a kind of a local issue.
If I start, I don't know when I'd stop. But yeah, as a number of you will be aware, like the 30th of November when Zero Waste had their Zoom meeting was the first time that I was alerted to what this project was all about. And we've had a bit of press coverage since then, but even so, there's still a heck of a lot of people who have no idea. There was interesting discussion in the MDC meeting last week where one of the councillors was really pushing for why hasn't this been more public, what happens next, what are the processes, and was getting no straight answers from the mayor or anyone. So the whole thing is just so behind closed doors. We've done, one of our members has done some local government official information requests for all the documents relating to discussions between Bioplant and MDC. And that's pretty much come up with almost nothing. And on further questioning, she's been told that there are no other documents. So there is no audit trail. It's stuff's, you know, what's happened to it. It's mysterious that there is no record of any meetings. There's emails that we got through that process, emails going to Manawatu district, but supposedly none of them were replied to because there was no replies provided. Helen Warboys has said that there is a agreement to supply waste. There's no information about any meetings, conversations, emails, anything around how that came about. So the lack of democratic process is just extraordinary. Yeah, don't know what else to say to that. That is, yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Angela. Yeah. Tricia?
Yeah, that's deeply concerning that that didn't reveal any information about meetings, considering we know for a fact that there were a number of meetings, not only meetings, but also tours around sites way early on in this process. We were told personally from members of MDC that those meetings had indeed occurred, and yet if there's no paperwork in order to evidence any of those meetings, that's very concerning.
That's collusion.
I can just also add that their justification for there being nothing made available to the public is that the process, Bioplant's process, is a proprietary process, so it's secret, but it's so particular. It so particularly meets the very unique needs of Manawatu district that legally they're not required to make that available to the public, which to me is just so challengeable. Like just how they think that they can stand on that ground and defend themselves, I don't know.
I'm going to stop screen sharing. And we'll return so everyone can see Angela for the moment. Yeah. I'm not sure quite where we're up to on our run sheet, but I think, Angela, you want to talk to next steps?
Yeah. I'm assuming that we're kind of running out of time, but if anyone had any questions that you've put them in chat. If not, if you've had questions that we haven't answered or you haven't put them up, don't hesitate to get in touch with any of us. We'll pass them on to the relevant expert in the team. Yeah, so next steps. The main thing is to get the submission in before next Thursday, 4:45, and to encourage as many friends, family, colleagues, anybody you know to do the same, and encourage them and let them know that it can be short and simple. It doesn't need to be complex. If you haven't already done so, it'd be great if you sign the petition that we've got going on Action Station. We can send a link in a follow-up email. If any of you are not already, like if you registered for the public meeting 2 weeks ago, we'll have your email address. If you didn't register for that, but you'd like us to be able to send stuff out to you, can you please somehow or another get your email address to us so that we can include you on a list? Not sure about what might be the best way to do that. Val, could they, yeah.
There's a few ways for people to get in touch.
Yeah.
So first of all, if people are on Facebook, they can join the Facebook Feilding Against Incineration page. They can also message me on the Zero Waste Network Facebook page, or email me at kyoto@zerowaste.co.nz. So if there are any questions, I can put them to Liam, I can put them to Tricia, I can put them to Angela. Depending on what the question is. So, and also if there's people who just want to be kept in touch, you can email me your details and I'll pass them along to Angela as well. Someone's posted in the chat the link to the petition, which is great to mention. So if people haven't signed that already. And we'll post the recording of this up on the Feilding Against Incineration page, once.
And we'll email it out as well, because some people have been in touch and said they don't do Facebook, but they really would value the resources. So I think that's pretty much, we, I guess, have been focusing completely on the submission process to this point. And once that's done, we'll be looking at what the next steps are that we need to take as a group. So I think that's it. So back to you, Val.
There's one little question over in the chat. Bruce is asking, any idea of which aspects rank highest in influencing the decision and likely to influence the public? So I just open the floor for that, if anybody wants to speak to either one of those.
Because that is two separate questions. The submission process is, in theory, totally focused on emissions to air, but like a number of us said, that we think providing a much broader context of our objections is a good idea. I'm not sure.
I think different arguments resonate with different people in terms of what the public is. Like, for some people, the issue of toxic emissions, for some people, the climate issue is first and foremost. For some people, the local, very local stuff about odor might be top of the. So it really depends on, who people are and what their, what their particular, talking politics of success rather than technology. Yes, we would agree with you, Bruce. It is really important to talk about all these different aspects, because all of these things matter. They just matter in different ways and different levels of priority to different people. In terms of the consent process, we think that primarily that will rest to some extent on some expert evidence, but will also be informed by all of the people in the community who are saying, we don't actually want this. We're not happy with what we're seeing and hearing here. So I think, as Angela said, we just have to to see this process through and then make some evaluation about the next steps. Yeah.
Okay.
Any other last questions or comments?
Just in terms of that question, just reflecting back to the olivines proposal that was quite a while ago, probably 15 plus years or so back in Huntley, the killer blow was the dioxin going into the air and then settling on the grass and disrupting, getting into the food chain. So I think that will be the thing to focus on and to mobilize the farming community that this stuff is going to drift everywhere, and you know, it's going to devalue the, you know, the region. You know, Feilding is a proud farming area, you know, and this is just sort of really, you know, devaluing that. And I think the other question I was going to make is our thoughts turn to sort of where to from here. It's probably quite a big job, but it might be really good if someone was able to go through and build on this, plus get some of these contextual points which are more likely to resonate with the community than the narrow points of law, and actually make a public, make all of the submission, all the key points public, so that this argument actually can be taken to the people. You know, the fact that, and I agree with what Val's saying, that different people will react to different things, you know, but the fact that Feilding is kind of like a guinea pig community, that they're actually going to start importing waste, if that, you know, there'll be a lot of really parochial, proud Feilding people. It's had the most beautiful city town in New Zealand for like decades and decades, suddenly turning into a waste processing centre for the central North Island. I think those are the key points which are outside the whole narrow focus of the submission, that the next step should be actually publicly taking those to the community and actually because politicians, you know, they're going to be really, really sensitive to public opinion on this, far more so than this narrow process. I kind of feel like it's kind of bulldozed. This is being bulldozed along under the sort of haze of all the COVID issues and weariness that people are got issue fatigue and trying to get on with life, and this is kind of happening under the radar, you know, and that kind of stuff. You know, when you paint a picture about this operation in that public discourse, that's the kind of stuff that's going to, I think, be really, really powerful.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Lots to think about. We encourage everybody, make sure your submission's in not later than 4:45 next Thursday, the 31st, thank you, 31st of March. Yeah. And with that, I just like to say again, thank you so much to everybody for being here this evening. Yeah, we wish you well and health over the weekend, and yeah, good luck with your submission. Feel free to reach out. And I'll just close with a little kara here and to say, yeah, thanks and acknowledgements to mana whenua always for their kaitiakitanga. Ka whakairia te kōrero ki te tāhu o tō tātou whare, ki tikina anō, he tona wā, he tona wahi, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e.
Yeah, well done, everybody.
Kia ora.
Well done,
Kia ora.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
everyone.
Kia ora.